In the autumn of 1939, millions of children across Europe went to school, believing their lives would follow a familiar path. There would be lessons, exams, friendships, arguments with teachers, and dreams about the future. But when World War II began, childhood itself became uncertain. In many cities, classrooms were darkened against air raids. Windows were taped to stop shattered glass from flying inward. Families listened to radios for news that seemed to grow worse by the day. For children living under Nazi occupation, the change was even more profound. One day, foreign soldiers marched through their streets. New flags hung from public buildings. Curfews appeared. Food became scarce. Newspapers began printing only what the occupiers allowed. A wrong word, a suspicious glance, or an act as small as owning an illegal radio could bring terrible consequences. Yet, in this world of fear, some schoolchildren made an extraordinary choice. They became messengers, scouts, code carriers, lookouts, and spies. They did not wear uniforms. They rarely carried weapons. Many were too young to fully understand the scale of the war around them. But because adults often overlooked them, children could move through occupied towns in ways that resistance fighters could not. Their school bags held more than books. Hidden between exercise papers and sandwiches might be a map, a message, a scrap of code, or information about enemy troops. Their ordinary appearance became their greatest disguise. A child cycling down a country road did not always attract attention. A teenager walking home from school might pass a railway station, a military depot, or a German checkpoint without being stopped. In wartime Europe, that made them valuable. This is the story of the young people who discovered that courage did not always look like a soldier on a battlefield. Sometimes it looked like a schoolchild carrying a secret through a city filled with danger. In occupied Poland, young people played one of the most remarkable roles in the underground resistance. Poland had been invaded by Nazi Germany in September 1939, and its people were subjected to a brutal occupation. Schools were restricted, universities were closed, and the Nazis tried to destroy Polish culture as well as Polish independence. But education did not disappear. It went underground. Teachers held illegal classes in private homes, apartments, churches, and basements. Students gathered quietly, pretending to visit relatives or friends. They studied history, literature, mathematics, and language in secret because simply learning could be considered an act of defiance. Among these young people were members of the Polish scouting movement. Before the war, scouting had taught them practical skills, discipline, teamwork, first aid, and a sense of civic duty. After the invasion, many of them transformed their organization into an underground network known as the Grey Ranks. The Grey Ranks included boys and girls who were still in school, or only recently out of it. Some delivered messages between resistance cells. Some distributed underground newspapers. Others watched German troop movements, noted the locations of military buildings, or collected intelligence about trains carrying soldiers and supplies eastward. They learned to memorize details instead of writing them down. A written note could be discovered in a search. Memory was safer, though it demanded calm under pressure. A young courier might count railway wagons while appearing to wait for a friend. They might notice the insignia on a soldier's uniform, the direction a convoy was heading, or the number of fuel trucks at a depot. Later, they would repeat what they had seen to someone in the resistance. The work was dangerous not because these children were reckless, but because the occupation was merciless. The Nazis did not treat young resistance members as harmless children if they were caught. Imprisonment, interrogation, deportation, and execution were real possibilities. Everyone involved understood this. Still, many continued. One reason was that young people often felt the war had stolen their future before they had the chance to shape it. Their schools had been taken from them. Their cities had been changed beyond recognition. Their families had been divided. Resistance gave them a way to reclaim some measure of control. In the Netherlands, teenagers also became deeply involved in resistance work after the German invasion of 1940. At first, life under occupation changed gradually. German troops were visible, but many Dutch people hoped the war might pass quickly. That hope disappeared as restrictions tightened. Jewish citizens were isolated, arrested, and deported. Men were forced into labor. Food shortages became severe. Resistance groups began to form across the country. Young people became essential to these networks. They carried illegal newspapers, helped distribute ration cards, and transported information between safe houses. Some helped hide Jewish families. Others watched German facilities and reported what they saw. A bicycle could be one of the most useful tools in occupied Europe. It was quiet, cheap, and common. A teenager on a bicycle could travel through a village or city without seeming unusual. But a bicycle basket could also conceal forged identity papers, food coupons, underground leaflets, or coded notes. The danger lay in the fact that ordinary life had become suspicious. German patrols stopped people at random. Identity documents were checked. Bags were searched. A teenager who looked nervous might draw attention. So, the young couriers had to learn how to appear completely normal. They had to look bored, distracted, impatient, or tired, just like any other student on the way home. That performance could be as important as anything they carried. In Denmark, a group of schoolboys showed how quickly youthful anger could become organized resistance. Denmark was occupied by Germany in 1940. In the early years, the Danish government remained in place under German pressure, and many people believed cooperation might protect the country from worse treatment. But as the war continued, resentment grew. In the city of Aalborg, a group of teenage boys became increasingly frustrated by what they saw as passivity. They were students, many only in their mid-teens, but they felt that waiting for adults to act was no longer enough. Inspired by Winston Churchill and by stories of resistance elsewhere in Europe, they called themselves the Churchill Club. At first, they carried out small acts of sabotage. They stole weapons from German soldiers when opportunities appeared. They damaged equipment. They set fire to German property and disrupted transport. Their actions were not large military operations, but that was not the point. They were proving that occupation could be resisted. The boys also gathered information. They watched German movements, identified vulnerable targets, and learned where supplies were being stored. Their local knowledge gave them an advantage. They knew the streets, the alleys, the rail yards, and the places where a young person could disappear without notice. Eventually, the authorities caught many members of the Churchill Club. They were arrested and imprisoned. Their youth did not protect them from punishment. But their story spread across Denmark, and it had an effect far beyond Aalborg. It showed others that even schoolchildren could refuse to accept occupation as normal. In France, the resistance also relied on young people, especially as the German occupation deepened and forced labor policies drove more citizens into hiding. Teenagers became guides through forests and mountains. They brought supplies to resistance fighters. They carried messages between villages. They helped Allied airmen who had been shot down find routes to safety. Some of these young people were barely old enough to understand the political arguments behind the war, but they understood what was happening in front of them. They saw neighbors disappear. They saw Jewish classmates excluded from school. They saw soldiers take food, homes, and freedom. For many, the decision to help the resistance began with one personal experience: a friend in danger, a parent arrested, a teacher who quietly asked for help. Resistance work was rarely glamorous. Most of it involved waiting. Waiting for a train to pass. Waiting for a patrol to leave. Waiting for darkness. Waiting in a doorway, pretending not to watch a building while counting the soldiers who entered and left. A young spy might spend days gathering a small piece of information. Perhaps they noticed that German trucks arrived at a certain depot every Tuesday morning. Perhaps they heard officers talking in a cafe. Perhaps they saw anti-aircraft guns being moved toward the coast. One detail alone might mean little. But when resistance networks combined observations from many different people, patterns began to emerge. Those patterns could save lives. Information about troop movements could help Allied forces understand where the Germans were strengthening their defenses. News about arrests could warn a resistance group to abandon a safe house. Knowledge of railway schedules could help sabotage teams choose targets. A message delivered across a town could prevent an ambush or allow someone to escape before the police arrived. The children involved in this work had to live double lives. In one moment, they might be sitting at a kitchen table while their parents worried about food rationing. In the next, they could be carrying a message that might endanger everyone in the household if discovered. Many parents knew nothing about what their children were doing. Others knew and lived with constant fear. Some families became resistance units themselves, with one person hiding a radio, another delivering supplies, and a child acting as a courier because they were the least likely to be suspected. But children were not invisible. The German authorities, their collaborators, and secret police forces eventually realized that young people could be involved in underground work. Checkpoints became stricter. Schools could be monitored. Teenagers who had once passed unnoticed began to face questioning and searches. The consequences of capture were devastating. Some young resistance members were sent to prisons or concentration camps. Some were tortured for information. Some never returned home. Their stories are difficult to hear because they force us to confront a terrible truth. War does not stop at the boundary of childhood, and yet the bravery of these young people should not be romanticized. They were not simply adventurous children playing at espionage. They were people forced into impossible circumstances. They acted because the world around them had collapsed into violence and oppression. Their courage came not from a lack of fear, but from acting despite fear. One of the most powerful aspects of their story is how often they used ordinary skills in extraordinary ways. A student's ability to memorize facts became a tool for intelligence work. A cyclist's knowledge of back roads became a route for smuggling messages. A young person's familiarity with the neighborhood became a way to monitor enemy activity. A talent for drawing might be used to sketch a military installation. Good handwriting could help create forged documents. Nothing about them looked heroic at first glance. That was exactly what made them effective. When the war in Europe finally ended in 1945, many of these young people were still remarkably young. Some returned to school. Some tried to find families who had been scattered by war. Some carried memories they could not easily share. A teenager who had spent years lying to soldiers, hiding from patrols, and fearing arrest could not simply become an ordinary student again overnight. For decades, many stories remained untold. Some survivors did not want to revisit the trauma. Others believed they had only done what was necessary and did not consider themselves heroes. But as time passed, historians, families, and communities began preserving these accounts. What emerged was a larger picture of resistance than most people had imagined. World War II was not fought only by generals, armies, and political leaders. It was also fought in kitchens, classrooms, train stations, and quiet streets. It was fought by people whose names never appeared in newspapers, and among them were schoolchildren who learned, far too early, what freedom was worth. Their legacy is not that children should have to become spies in wartime. No child should ever face that choice. Their legacy is a reminder that courage can exist in people whom the powerful dismiss as unimportant. The occupiers saw children as weak, innocent, and easy to control. But those children understood their own streets better than any invading army. They knew who belonged and who did not. They knew which doors could be trusted, which roads were safest, and which details mattered. They carried secrets in their memories. They carried hope in their school bags. And in a world ruled by fear, they helped prove that even the smallest acts of resistance could become part of something much larger. The schoolchildren who became spies did not choose the world they inherited. But in the darkest years of World War II, many chose what they would do within it. That choice became their quiet, extraordinary act of defiance.